Hello, everyone. Our interview today is with Nabeel Hamdi. He qualified at the Architectural Association in London in 1968. He worked for the Greater London Council between 1969 and 1978, where his award-winning housing projects established his reputation in participatory design and planning. He founded the master's course in development practice at Oxford Brookes University in 1992, which was awarded the Queen's Anniversary Prize for Higher and Further Education in 2001. He was a recently visiting professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and is currently professor emeritus at Oxford Brookes University. Nabeel has consulted on housing, participatory action planning, and upgrading of slums in cities to all major international development agencies and to charities and NGOs worldwide. He is the author of The Spacemaker's Guide to Big Change, The Placemaker's Guide to Building Community, Small Change, and Housing Without Houses. Hello, Nabeel. Very good to speak with you.
Hello, David. It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me for the interview.
Oh, you're very welcome. Glad to speak with you. One thing that I'm very interested in is your history in participatory development.
Indeed, David. That's something that interested me enormously about the program that currently is being set up, and that is that there's a real focus, it seems to me, on the role that communities can play in both urban regeneration, housing, urban development, and various aspects of city building. My own background in that, which I think tells something of where I come from so far as my interest is concerned in the program and, of course, my career so far. I, in fact, finished my thesis at the AAA, at the Architectural Association, as you mentioned, and it was based on the work of a Dutchman called John Houbraken, who was talking very much about building supports as a flexible way in which one can engage with people, low-income people, mostly social housing tenants, in designing their own homes. And that got me very interested in that whole subject. And in fact, my final thesis was done with a colleague of mine, Nick Wilkinson. We presented that to the Greater London Council, and they, at that time, this was early 70s, decided that it would be worth trying out. And that's indeed what we did. And it was my first experience in trying to understand what it meant in terms of the tools and techniques of the business, not just in terms of ideas and attitudes, but what tools such as models, guidebooks, plans, mapping exercises do we use to engage with families who did not necessarily know how to read architectural drawings as such, but who had a very clear idea of what they wanted in terms of their homes. The first project was completed in Stamford Hill, and we did 2 programs. The second project in Adelaide Road. And I would say that the first was very much of a short trial. The second was a more extensive application of the ideals. And through that, I became very interested in the methodology, the tools, and looked to expand the ideals beyond just simply the housing programs here. I then got a job at MIT, where I worked there. I taught there for something like 10 years, between 81 and 90. And that was the first time that I became much more engaged in the international development work because of the programs that they were doing at the time. And it was interesting for me to see how much of the work that we were doing in London in terms of the tools and techniques, not the projects themselves, obviously, could be applied, modified, adapted to work with working with communities living in the developing countries. From then on, yes, indeed, lots of work in different countries, lots of experience and so on. I think one of the key aspects that have interested me has been the way in which not only we engage with communities, but where they take a lead role in deciding on programs and projects. Certainly one of the aspects that interests me about this program is the extent to which that can be applied in various kind of fields, whether it's housing, whether it's water, sanitation, urban development, urban design, and so on. So that's my background, and that's certainly my interest in it all.
When you were first interacting with people in participatory housing, did you find communication with clients as well as the translation into built facts on the ground? Did you find that there were things that were very eagerly implemented, or were there obstacles that you needed to get past in order to get to successful results?
Well, indeed, there were many obstacles at many different levels, and I think it's a very good question. One of the big obstacles, indeed, was our own professional roles as architects, where we assumed that we actually knew it all. Yes, I'll talk to you and I will consult with you, but I will do the designing and I will make the final decisions. And that's the way we were taught. That's the way we were brought up. Any uncertainty was considered to be a sign of weakness in terms of one's architectural education and background. So one of the biggest constraints was, in fact, to begin to break down the barriers between professionals and people. What new roles would the professionals need to take in the context of a participatory program? And here we get into a discussion about the role of an enabler. And I always say, well, look, if we're going to figure out what we're going to provide, whether it's in housing, water, sanitation, whatever it might be, the first question to ask is, what is it trying to enable? And unless we ask that question, then we don't know exactly what to provide or how much to provide of what. And that might be money, it might be tools, it might be structures, all different kinds of aspects of design process. So certainly one of the biggest constraints was that change in role and relationship amongst professionals. I think a second, in the earliest days, of course, constraint was the extent to which the local authorities, the government authorities that I worked with, accepted the involvement of communities, of families, and so on. In other words, in the London project, certainly, yes, we can talk to them about what they would like their interiors to be like, but the exterior and the discussion about the public open spaces and the play areas and car parking and so on was very much still in the administrative role. So again, there was a barrier to break that down. So, well, why can't we engage on a much broader basis? I think certainly the third barrier was in terms of the tools and techniques. I mean, if you look at some of the consulting exercises that are done, even today, fairly sophisticated drawings are put up in town halls or wherever, village halls and so on. And the expectation is that people can read these things and then comment on them. And that's obviously not easy for everyone. Hence, the acceptance of various tools that you can engage with. And sometimes we access information in the most unconventional way. For example, I've been working with non-literate communities where words and drawings just don't count. So they will often act out their needs, or you'll often find sort of theatricals that describe what they want. There are chants in certain countries, in certain cultures, where the song actually tells you, by way of narrative, what the program might be looking like, whether it's food security and so on. So all of those new techniques are kind of barriers in a way, initially barriers, because they didn't seem to be professional. And am I going to sit there and listen to somebody singing to me their program? Not very easy to do as such.
That's a very interesting way of framing this challenge, but also the opportunity of the communication. It sounds like the more theatrical style performance, although it's non-conventional in terms of what architects are typically used to, it sounds like it might give you a very good idea, say, of spatial relations and dynamics if someone is enacting something. Did you find that to be the case, that it opened up?
Indeed, that is the case, that actually the spatial qualities of anywhere, when one's actually performing in space, become fundamental, both in terms of background, but also in terms of the value of the space, in terms of being able to do what you do. And certainly one begins to shape space based on perception as much as performance. And from that comes a set of values that one can begin to talk about and understand insofar as the activities that might be contained. But not only that, what is public and what is private. That can also be acted out. Where are the commons, as it were? Who owns what in terms of social ownership? And all those spatial values in some cultures, of course, are much more easily described either in song, in poetry, in theater and so on, rather than necessarily sketched out in drawings. Having said that, of course, a lot of people will be very comfortable with mapping out the value of different kinds of public open spaces and what the concept of private might mean in different countries and different contexts. That, again, is something we can't assume, what is public and what is private. I often put up a picture of a formal settlement, wherever it might be, in India, wherever, very dense, very compact set of spaces and buildings. I ask people to look at it, into it very deeply and ask, what is public, what is private, what is front, what is back, where do the children play? What happens when there's a fire? All these kinds of questions which we take for granted. And when you look at the pictures, you say, my goodness me, that's challenging. That begins again to unravel in different ways. And we can role play that in different ways. I can usually play that game with children, with women, with men, with the employed, the unemployed, and you get different perceptions of what we're looking at.
Oh, it sounds like translation really is a very important word with this, and especially as regards values that might not be typically the ones that 20th century and, as far as it goes, 21st century architecture have been pushing, which would be, say, optimizing for cost or material efficiency. Have you found that with this participatory process, especially with the informal settlements, that certain values come to the fore in a surprising way that otherwise might not be discovered?
They do indeed, and sometimes one has to generalize from them. Some of the consistent themes that come out, for example, in terms of values, are to do with equity, which is the equitable or the fair access that people have to essential resources. And that may be land, it may be materials, it may be information, it may be knowledge, and so on. So certainly equity is one that constantly seems to recur as a value. Resilience is another one, and I know that's a fairly up-to-date term these days, but the ability to be able to resist the shocks and stresses of daily life, to cope with them as they arise, and then to recover from them once the stress or whatever it might be has disappeared. And all of that demands a whole bundle of assets, some of what we call tangible assets, materials, equipment, and so on. But importantly, the intangible assets, your social networks, your cultural identity, your sense of belonging, which actually we kind of tend to deny when we're talking in architectural terms, or at least we believe to kind of encapsulate, incorporate that automatically in what we do. So certainly those values do come out and need expression in different ways.
Are there any specific examples of projects that come to mind where the values such as resilience or adaptability or the space or shared resources had to be expressed in a specific manner?
I would say a lot of the examples are built into almost every informal improvement or informal urban regeneration program that I've done. They come with different priorities, they come in different sequences, but those seem to recur constantly. People are constantly talking about fairness, and when they talk about their vulnerability, for example, in projects in India, for example, that I've done in Sri Lanka, in Ecuador, and Peru, all over the place, people talk about the need to reduce their vulnerability. And that really means building up their assets again. And you kind of question as to what that really might mean. Well, if you can look at even the running and the management of a standpipe, a water tap, people generally don't have easy access to it, but one can reduce vulnerability by creating a social enterprise around managing water, and usually women and children who do that. You can collect a bit of money that goes into a community fund that can subsidize buckets to collect garbage. So you build up that resource base. With that, you also build up the equity when it comes to gender relations. You give us a sense of partnerships between the social enterprise that runs the water tap and the water authority. So then you've got a model of good governance that builds up. So the whole thing trickles up from that. I can talk about examples of water taps and trickle up to good governance in that sense. One doesn't have to really talk necessarily big programs.
That's amazing. It sounds like there's a very direct, what people mostly think of as abstract things, of a culture coming out of a landscape and an infrastructure that here, with what you've directly experienced, you see almost a one-to-one relationship between cultural patterns and interactions and how the surroundings are shaped and used.
Indeed. And important in that respect is, again, the question of social ownership. If I take my standpipe example, through a social enterprise, you have social ownership of a utility, a resource essentially, that otherwise is neglected and goes to waste, and people care. So that ownership actually translates into well-being, it translates into good governance, it translates into more voice, more equity in terms of gender relations, and so on. And that's, I keep arguing with all my work, what we're searching for usually is catalysts rather than end states. I always, however worthy, object to the question that's usually asked in the context of the work that we do. How much can I do and how quickly can I do it? For me, that's the wrong question. For me, it's how little do I need to do in terms of getting started, and then how do I scale it up and keep it going? That search is for beginnings. It's for searching for starters. Where can I actually begin? Then how can I build it up?
It's very interesting to me that it sounds like if someone comes in asking how much that they can do, as you were saying, that it can end up being the unfortunately typical ill-fitting shoe solution where
Yes.
infrastructure doesn't get used. And then you see things not connecting to government, not connecting to people's daily habits. And it sounds like your investigation and your methodology is trying to find this active self-driving connection, and that if you're listening to the values and the culture, then you can hook that up to make it self-sufficient.
That is very true. I think the how much can I do is a very worthy question, but it tends to, quite rightly as you say, it tends to lead to the big plan. And we've got to get the big plan right before we can start. And I keep going, so, well, you can't get the big plan until you start, which implies an action science and action research approach, an incremental one. The first step tells you something about the next steps, which tells you something about the next steps, and so on. And that, again, can be challenging professionally, which is why I think I get sometimes objections from that, because after all, it seems like you're losing control. For me, you're not, in fact. But for many, it seems like you're divesting control to non-professionals. And, of course, to the participatory process, you are in partnership with others. We don't get people to participate because we're trying to be nice to them. We do it because we need them. It's part of the team, as it were. That knowledge of place that is implicit in place in the minds and practices of ordinary people. And we need that expertise. So that's really my big objection to the how much we can do, not the worthiness, but that it tends to lead to the big plan, which of course takes time to do. And when I was working in Bangladesh some years ago, that big plan took something like 4 years to develop, by which time the data had run out of date. The money had run out, and so we had to go on and collect more data and carry on doing that sort of thing. Nothing actually happened as such. So I really have great questions about the big planning approach these days.
What you're describing really relates to some of the other conversations that I've had in these interviews where these new techniques that are developed and applied are a step beyond the factory process, that being that you look at a program and requirements and plan and develop something, execute, and then deliver. And so then what you have, the process for a house or a community is essentially the same that you have in the process for a car, except, as we were talking about, does not include these things that help the community sustain itself and to fit. And there is some resistance to this in the greater process because, factory production is so ingrained and so habituated.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the specific ways in which you've been able to fit this interactive process into execution, into building, where you're kind of living in both worlds, where you're building, testing, and adjusting, and also relying on processes that are very factory driven.
Yeah, I mean, I think the testing is the difficult part. I mean, I think what is, again, probably difficult and a constraint for a lot of architects is that a lot of this work doesn't necessarily have the title of the architect attached to it. It's again a question of ownership. People ask me, and students ask me, so point to your projects. Well, it's very difficult to do that in the conventional sense of, yes, this is my building and that's the school I designed and so on. I tend to be all the time pointing to process and to method and to the extraordinary way in which people have accepted and adapted those and have come up with their own solutions, with help, of course. And I tend to use what I call my PEAS, my P's methodology, which I referred to a little bit earlier. P is for providing. We've always got to provide something, but we don't know what to provide unless we know what it is we're trying to enable. And here I come to John Turner's wonderful quote, which is what a house does in terms of its ability to generate employment, create a sense of identity, build security. It's equally, if not more important than what it is. We know what it is, but what does it do? And it's the is and the does routine that's important. So what does a house is what we provide. What does it enable is something else. The A in P's is how can it be adapted? We all know that in order to maintain a good fit between people and place, it has to be adaptable to changing circumstances. So to what extent have we provided enough or not enough insofar as its adaptability? And have we provided in the right way, whether it's providing money, whether it's providing materials, skills, training, and that sort of stuff to keep it going. And the S, of course, of P's is sustain. How do we keep it all going? And that, again, invokes a revisit to what it is we might have provided or not provided in terms of continuity. Is there enough institutional capacity to keep it going, and so on. And I think the best examples I can point to with that process were in our work in Sri Lanka, where to this day there was a project that was started at MIT in the mid-'80s. To this day, there are community development councils that sit on the Colombo planning committees, voicing their concerns and their opinions and their needs and their desires and so on. And that program really picked up wonderfully as part of their Million Houses program.
Do you have any thoughts about the school that you had wanted to say about it?
What I was encouraged and what attracts me to it is the openness of the agenda, very clear values in terms of what it's promoting. I very much like the relationship there is between the emphasis that's been given, that wonderful harmony that we all are trying to achieve between the built environment and the natural environment, between the social economy and the market economy, all of which gives value to place, not one or the other any longer. So that, for me, the program gives context, therefore, for new kinds of partnerships, new forms of engagement between civil society groups, government authorities, and even the market, which is, after all, the good governance model that we still have to explore. So for me, all the background that I have and the importance that I attach to community action planning, there really is here an opportunity to disseminate those ideals and that work, to give them context beyond, discrete individual programs here and there.
Along those lines, with the school, the students are going to be able to build something and contribute and see how that engages in efforts to build something that is, as you were saying before, sustainable.
No, I think that's again part of the whole value, I think, of the program, the concept of history, whose identity counts, whose history dominates. And I would love to see the concept of history being mapped out by various groups. And those groups can be different ethnic groups. They might be different groups in terms of age. How do the young perceive history? How do the old perceive history? In other words, we actually are building up a narrative of place that helps guide our programming and not just a discrete, usual, typical technical program. And I think there's enormous value in that sort of process, and particularly in the context of using the participatory methods that I've been referring to.
Interesting. So you'd say then that your methods would be a way to look at various intersubjective perspectives on not only a place, but the history of the place in order to understand how those relations go forward and how the physical space might be shaped to work with them?
Indeed. What is it that we give value to? How do different groups give different value to different parts of the space and the buildings that surround it, perhaps? Some will see history as interfering with progress because of the resentments that build up, perhaps. Others will see it as an absolutely important part of understanding where we go from here. And I think all of that needs to be... It's a complex process. We tend to assume historical precedents in what I would call an oversimplified way. In other words, through the symbolism of place, through story of place as told to us in history books, if you like, or historical documents, whatever it might be, and so on. And I'm fascinated, even in the most informal of settlements, to understand the history of place in terms of people's aspirations, in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their family histories, and so on. Again, that intangible set of assets that are not necessarily visible. I always like to just add one thing there, which is I always like to think that, as we all know, places are made out of the visible structure of place, which is stuff that we go around and photograph and map and document and so on. But then there's the invisible structure of place, those social alliances, that cultural heritage, that sense of belonging. How do we map that out as part of our programming? And we tend to kind of preempt that. We tend to make assumptions about it based on precedents. And I'm very interested in looking at the way in which participatory work can begin to reveal, to make visible that invisible structure of place.
Oh, I certainly agree with that this social and mental and even spiritual context which goes along with it and will perhaps be activated in different ways by the space or react to the space. In a lot of ways, to think about this from another angle, that in the development, the use and development of space itself, these ideas and the way the ideas and perspectives change can radically change how something is made and how in the history of architecture these different ways of being and ways of thinking have changed what is done and how.
Very true. No, I think that's absolutely right. And I always think that it's those changes that we need to begin to accommodate. Very often we're threatened by those changes because, after all, some may have built up their careers on ways of doing things that may be challenged by this different approach. And certainly a lot of participatory work is seen as a constraint because it's seen as a threat to professional activity. Again, it's a question of whose authorship do we attach to place when we've got a whole bundle of people doing all sorts of different things, from the programming stage right through to the implementation stage. And the lack of authorship is problematic for architects. I can't point to what's mine so easily, at least.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a dramatic shift that I've been seeing as a trend happening, is the shift away from architect as someone who delivers a pre-made piece into someone who activates something through discovering a mutual understanding. And I think the understanding of where they have been and where history has been is very important to distinguishing between what is happening in a specific place. I think that there's a great opportunity for more to happen with architecture and more to happen with individual architects in this mode.
Absolutely. I mean, I always think, David, that there's a wonderful UN statistic, something like 5%, and it may be 10, it may be 15, but a very, very small percent of the built environment is actually designed by architects and planners. And my question really is that if that's the case, why is it that 95% of architects go chasing 5% of the jobs? So there's actually a much greater opportunity if one engages with the broader social and physical spatial development of cities. And if one begins to think of different roles that we can play in relationship to it. And that change in role, of course, needs to be supported by our professional institutions. And that has been, to some extent, another barrier. It is changing, I must admit. But again, It's not just within the profession, it's within the professional institutions that change needs to be encouraged.
Yes, I've certainly noticed some of that. Have you seen that it is still mostly dominated by, conceptualizing and presenting, or have you seen more of this expanded view percolate into institutions?
It's beginning to percolate. I have seen it percolating. I mean, certainly our own institutions here in England are beginning to kind of think in terms of diversifying the role that the architect may play. That still has to kind of begin to filter down into education, which is, again, why I think your program here is so important, because it actually begins to expand the boundaries of architectural practice and begin to redefine what the architect might be and might do. And that, of course, will translate into the tools and techniques that we might have to teach, that we may not be teaching at the moment. So I think it is beginning to filter down. There's no question about it. And certainly when I started work in the mid-'70s with participatory work, the change between now and then is enormous, needless to say. But constantly there's a threat of appropriation by the big corporate institutions and by the profession itself. There's a constant desire to give authorship, as it were, to it in one's own name. That has to change.
That's interesting. Disconcerting, but interesting. The idea that it could be, similar to greenwashing with ecological design, that the idea of lack of ego could be packaged and marketed as a new type of ego.
Yes, excellent. That's a nice way of putting it. Very good way of putting it.
Before we wrap up here, is there anything that you're especially looking forward to with interactions with the school in the near future?
Well, I think one of the things I'm looking forward to is the ability to be able to disseminate some of the work and ideals that we're talking about here, and that seem to be implicit in the program. I'm fascinated always with any group as to the way in which they're translated. In other words, there is no single way of interpreting these values and the methods. I don't think I've ever done a project the same twice. And so what does that mean in terms of the groups that we're going to engage with? Give them a sense of ownership of the program as such, give them the ability to be able to shape it in a manner that suits their own ideals, but in discussion and in collaboration. Again, the process itself is participatory in that sense. So I'm really intrigued in finding out how it's going to actually work in that respect. I think that's something I always look forward to in terms of these programs. I certainly think the context is interesting as well.
Everyone is certainly looking forward to getting it on the ground and going. And we'll definitely enjoy staying in touch with you about it.
Great. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for speaking with us.